Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and I have with me a very distinguished professor, I might add, of marine sciences at Stony Brook, our great university we have right here in Long Island, and his name is Dr. Chris Gobler. Do you call yourself doctor? I often wonder about that.
Well, I usually don't call myself anything. So.
Right, I mean,
but you can call me whatever you like.
I'll call you Chris.
That's great.
I'm just so thrilled that we could finally have this conversation because I am so concerned about the state of our water here in Long Island with our sole source aquifer. But before we get into that, I would like to know a little bit about you. Where were you born, raised, and went to school?
Well, that's all pretty easy. The answer for all those is Long Island. I was born in Port Jefferson, and I grew up in South Setauket, and I did go away as an undergraduate to the University of Delaware. But then thereafter, I was at Stony Brook University for my both my master's degree and for my PhD. And so, and then I moved to the East End for my first job in 1999 at Long Island University's Southampton College.
Wow. Well, there's no place, as far as I'm concerned, that's better than Long Island.
Well,
I mean,
I truly agree with you.
I truly adore it.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I was getting out of the bay, my bay. It's my bay, Gardeners Bay. I call it my bay.
It's a nice one.
And I was saying to some lady there, because we have a lot of rocks on our beach there, I said, you know, I bet these rocks are really terminal moraine. And it just so happens that the woman was a geologist with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Wow.
She gave me the whole history of the formation of Long Island as being, you know, formed by that glacier.
Yep.
And how special this place really is.
Yeah.
So give us a little idea of where we stand with our water.
Well, you know, the state of our water, both our drinking water and our surface waters here in Long Island is very closely and intimately linked with what's happening on land. And you know, we have a finite amount of space in Long Island, and there's was tremendous growth in our population through the second half of the 20th century. And obviously here in the East End in particular, that's continued through this century. The statistics I always like to use about Suffolk County, little rural Suffolk County, has more people in it right now than does Nassau County. It has more people than Staten Island. It has more people than the Bronx. It actually has more people than Manhattan. So at almost 1.6 million people, there's a lot of people here in Suffolk County. And all those people, of course, and the activity associated with them is changing our groundwater, which is then connected to our surface waters. So
I'm just going to interrupt you to tell you that I had some statistic, which was that in 1950, there were 250 some odd people living here.
Yeah.
50,000 people.
Yeah.
And then
only,
it just mushroomed out in the next years to the 1970s when it was 1 million.
Yeah, yeah, and if you made Suffolk County its own country, it'd be something like within the top 10 most densely populated, so number of people per unit area. So it's a lot of people, and so what we're seeing now is that that's changing the characteristics of our groundwater. And so the big thing that we've noticed is that the concentrations of nitrogen in our groundwater are progressively increasing year after year, decade after decade. And that groundwater is it's our sole source of drinking water. But the nitrogen levels are not a human health concern, thankfully, yet, in most places at least. However, the concentrations of nitrogen are very high compared to what's in our surface waters. And any of the groundwater that we don't use as drinking water ultimately is discharged into our surface waters, our harbors, bays, our estuaries. And because the concentrations of nitrogen are so high in that groundwater, as it seeps out, it stimulates the growth of algae, and that has a large trickle-down and cascading effect on our coastal waters.
You know, I'm on the I don't know how I got on the list, but I'm on Suffolk County Health Department list, and I get all the time about the algae blooms in different places. And, you know, I mean, sometimes I scratch my head and I say, in Mattatuck?
Yeah.
I remember Mattatuck when I don't think there was a couple of thousand people. And now they have areas where there are all of these different places, like Agawam, all of them, they are closed.
Yeah, and you know, every area, the main sources of nitrogen, and I should also mention phosphorus is also important for fresh water. The sources of those two nutrient elements, nitrogen and phosphorus, differs. Over all of Suffolk County, the main source is what we call wastewater, people's household septic tanks and cesspools. There's over 360,000 homes in Suffolk County that are not connected to sewage treatment plants, but rather just have their own individual on-site septic systems that are designed to let the wastewater drain from them and into the groundwater. And that's a large source, or I should not say large, that's the biggest source of nitrogen to the groundwater and surface waters in Suffolk County. There are some regional areas, and I introduced this because of, for example, in Mattatuck, you have a lot of people, but there's also some agriculture there.
Yes.
A fair bit, and it's been there for a while. And
yes.
So, and that's why that's an area where you have problems, places like Marituka Lake and the Mattatuck Inlet and some other lakes in the area also.
Yes, there still is an agriculture, and isn't there something about agriculture and lawns and things like that, those kind of things that people use?
Certainly, and so the same two culprits, nitrogen and phosphorus, are in fertilizer, and so you know, areas near farms, the groundwater can be enriched in nitrogen and phosphorus. The overuse on lawns is also a source. Again, it's regionally specific. On average, the fertilizers are second most important behind wastewater. But there are certain regions where there's, say, intense agriculture where the fertilizers are the most important source.
Could you explain to our audience a little bit about the layers of the aquifer?
Sure, yeah, it's fascinating. It goes down literally hundreds of feet. And the deeper you go down, the older the groundwater is. That it means it's been a longer amount of time since it's been at the surface. And also the less likely it is to affect our surface water. So the top layer is called the upper glacial, and the depth varies depending whether you're in the North Shore or the South Shore, but it's dozens of feet deep is a safe assumption. Again, there's a sort of a slope from the South to the North Shore. That's the water that's the most likely to affect our surface waters. It's also the groundwater that's the most likely to be contaminated. And so, for example, most of Suffolk County gets their drinking water from Suffolk County Water Authority, although less so here in the East End. Suffolk County Water Authority has abandoned most of its upper glacial aquifer wells because they become contaminated with nitrogen or pesticides or other things. And therefore, they're going deeper. And the next layer down is called the Magathie, and that can go down hundreds of feet, again, depending on the North Shore, the South Shore. And that's more pristine, although even in the Magathie,
yes, I know, we've
seen the rising levels of nitrogen, and that the levels of nitrogen in the Magathie now are the same as they were in the upper glacial only a couple of decades ago. And then the very deepest one is called the Lloyd Aquifer, and there's actually a layer. All of these aquifers are comprised of sand, so the water goes through them very quickly. There's a clay layer that separates parts of the deepest one, the Lloyd and the Magathie. So it really does isolate it. And that Lloyd aquifer is very deep and thankfully still very pristine. And so, and in some cases, it's now the source of drinking water for some places. But if you have your own well, you're typically confined to that upper glacial aquifer. And so that's why I would say, anybody listening, if you have a private well, please do get it tested, because you never know, even if it's good one year, because of regional activities, it can get contaminated. And that happens particularly here in the South Fork in East Hampton, unfortunately, commonly. So it's important for people with private wells to get that water tested.
So one of the things that I have been anxiously awaiting is for the Department of Health here in our Suffolk County to come up with some kind of a septic system, because we're never going to have all sewering. It's just too large,
Yes,
you know.
Correct.
And it would be crazy to even contemplate billions and billions of dollars going into that kind of thing. But we certainly are looking forward to having a septic system that can mitigate some of this nitrogen, that doesn't put us all into the poorhouse.
Right.
And that's what I've been waiting. I can remember interviewing Alison Bronco from the Peconic Estuary, I think almost 2 years ago. And she told me it was eminently coming, and I've been eminently waiting for it. And how are we now at this point?
Well, we're a lot closer. In fact, Suffolk County right now has drafted a new piece of its actual constitution. It's going to be called Article 19. And Article 19 is to have these new systems approvable for individual homes. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe there are going to be hearings on this before the Suffolk County Legislature in the coming weeks. Yeah, so it's a huge step and definitely in the right direction. And they, in advance of this, Suffolk County has been pilot testing a series of alternative septic systems that do a better job of removing nitrogen. So once the Article 19 is passed, they'll then, because of the pilot work, they'll be ready to approve a series of alternative systems, which are good systems and, like I said, remove more nitrogen.
You know, I don't know. I have to say this because I sometimes think that people don't realize where nitrogen comes from.
Yes.
Nitrogenous waste comes from your urine, by the way.
That's true.
That's something that, you know, people sometimes, oh, really? Is that where that, is that what that nitrogen is?
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
And
so an interesting fact, I don't know if we want to discuss it, but
I do.
I think it's fascinating, actually. Of the household wastewater stream, which is, mixes everything from toilets to showers to dishwashers and everything in between. By volume, 1% of that is urine, but 75% of the nitrogen comes from that urine. And so I should mention
that is new. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so I'm also at the university. I'm the co-director of the New York State Center for Clean Water Technology, and so we're doing many things. One is trying to come up with new systems that do an even better job of removing nitrogen and other contaminants. We also did something recently called a technology assessment, where we took a global view of all the technologies out there and all the things that could be done. And we ranked all of those. We had a whole matrix system to see, well, what would be the best approach here in Suffolk County. And interestingly, urine separation came up as a pretty high alternative. So, we're not there yet. And this gets done sometimes in Europe. But there probably are some opportunities.
You mean Europe is doing something that we have not done yet?
Yes, this is true, yes.
You mean like burying the lines as well? They did that too.
That would be another one. But,
yes.
But on this front, if men's public restrooms would be an obvious first place where we could divert some of that and repurpose it, because once it's diverted, rich in nitrogen can be converted to fertilizer or some other purpose, for example.
Yes, isn't that amazing? That the thing that that is something that we worry about is also something that we use when we're fertilizing our gardens. And
yes, exactly. And so I believe there are good opportunities to think about all sorts of waste for repurposing and for particularly on the nitrogen front. So, for example, another project that I'm interested in surface waters, in many places there's a great overgrowth of seaweeds, also known as macroalgae, because there's lots of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, and they just grow like mad in certain places. And so involved in a project now where we're considering, can we remove that, physically remove that macroalgae and seaweed and repurpose that for something like a fertilizer? So you'd be actively not only removing nitrogen and phosphorus, but then using it for something that, and replacing what would have been an imported fertilizer. So.
You know, I'm an old Fire Islander, went there for 35 years, and I had a guy next door to me who used to collect the seaweed, put it into a garbage pail that he had holes in.
Yeah.
He'd wash it, and he'd put it around all of his plants, the seaweed,
yeah.
you know, and he had the most gorgeous gardens.
Yeah, and so what one of the projects we're working on is considering, can that be done in a more purposeful way, larger scale, to actually affect conditions in the water? And some preliminary evidence suggests that there might be something to that.
Yes, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to also mention is that we do have a vote coming up this wonderful election day.
Yes.
And it will be to continue with the CPF fund.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is going to be that 20% of what they collect in the 2% tax every time, I believe it's 2% of every sale.
Yeah.
And then they're going to put that extra 20% of that money into helping people to create, you know, a better kind of septic system at their homes.
Yeah, no, I think, generally address water quality issues. And I think, Supervisor Larry Cantwell has explained this issue very well, and that, East Hampton Town has done a great job of preserving lots of land, and this won't prevent that from happening, but rather it'll make some funds available for improving water quality, and a lot of it may be helping people get advanced septic systems. There's certain areas here in East Hampton Town that are more vulnerable than others to surface water contamination.
Yeah,
and
like
so,
Lake Montauk.
for example, the back end of 3 Mile Harbor is another area that's very vulnerable and
Which I
sensitive.
pass every day back and forth.
Yeah, and so this, if it can be done in a targeted way, purposeful way, it can be a great benefit to the environment.
And so, tell us, what else do you think people should be aware of in their everyday? I mean, I know I only use like organic type of things that I don't put anything on my lawn. I don't care about my lawn. Just cut it, and that's all that matters to me, But even in household products, I don't think people quite realize that everything you use, where it's going. And
well, that's the whole thing, is that we are, whatever is being used on the surface of the land is what we're drinking, and you really can't escape it. Even in areas where people are on public drinking water, for example, one might think, oh, well, I have Suffolk County water, so it comes from the Pine Barrens. And, I live here and wherever they live, and it's coming from far away. But the truth of the matter is, on average, there's hundreds of wells that are used. And, Suffolk County Water Authority doesn't go through the effort of pumping the water all across the county, but rather you get it from your local wellhead. And on average, I think it's 2 or 3 miles from each home. So with the bottom line being the activities that we all undergo on land and our neighbors is what ends up in our drinking water. And like I said earlier, particularly with regards to private wells, you have to be really careful. And certainly things that are put on lawns, not just the nitrogen and phosphorus, but other things do end up in our in the groundwater. And then ultimately, you can worry about your drinking water, but then thereafter we think about the sensitivity of our surface waters.
How do we get our water tested? Where would a person go to get that done?
That's a great question. Suffolk County Department of Health offers that as a service. There is a fee associated with it, but it's a nominal fee, and obviously, it's, in order to protect your health and your family's health, it's certainly
because I haven't had it done for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's it's always. I have a private well living on the East End, and I was actually surprised, for example, that nitrogen concentration in my groundwater doubled over about a 10-year period. It's still in the safe zone, but it's clearly rising. And they tested for literally hundreds of compounds, which is great. But they found very trace levels of caffeine in my drinking water. Now, of course, nothing that would actually have an effect, but just shows you the interconnected nature of our service activity and our groundwater and our surface waters.
I think it's called the Earth, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, isn't it everything really kind of
Absolutely.
interconnected?
Yeah.
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
there's
Absolutely.
nothing is separate. You know.
That's right. And I haven't said it, but I think what I want to emphasize is that we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus going to our coastal waters, and and algae blooms. Well, algae, that's bad, But beyond just the algae, the trickle-down effects thereafter are important to state. And so I'll just rattle off a few things really quickly. Since the 20th century, we've lost 90% of our seagrass on Long Island. And seagrass is the habitat where fish grow up and shellfish grow up. And so 90%, it's a lot. And sometimes I hear that statistic and I say to myself, is that really real? But then I talk to neighbors who will take me to a place in an estuary and say, I grew up here. This used to be all seagrass, and now look at the bottom, and it's just bare. So that's one trickle down. So nitrogen, algae, overgrowth of algae, loss of seagrass. And then fisheries. Shellfish, historically, clams, scallops, mussels, oysters, have historically been the most productive fisheries in New York State. So people hear the word fisheries, they'll think about finfish, but it's actually always been shellfish that has been the most important fishery for New York State. Since 1980, shell fisheries, depending on the species, are down somewhere between 70 and 90%. And again, that's because of loss of seagrass and these algal blooms. And then the last thing I'll just mention is wetlands are an important habitat.
Yes.
They're important for fisheries. They're important for protecting coastal communities from wave and storm surge. And we've lost somewhere between 40 and 80% of our wetlands since the 20th century, again, depending on where you are. And we learned recently that the overloading of nitrogen actually weakens the root systems of these systems and of the wetlands and is leading to their losses. So, it's not just the algae in the water looks bad, but it's the whole fabric of these marine ecosystems, the habitats, seagrasses, wetlands, and the organisms we care the most about, our important fisheries, the shellfish, are really on the ropes. And so it's not just the water looks bad, but it's the whole, like I said, the whole fabric and the interconnectedness of the system. And of course, here in the East End, that is so critical because our economy revolves around many of these things. Tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Recreational fishing is a billion-dollar industry. Commercial fishing is a billion-dollar industry. Recreational boating is a billion-dollar industry each year in Suffolk County alone. And so there's a lot at stake. So it's not just discolored water, but it's our economy is interconnected as well.
One little experience that I remember in my first going out to Fire Island in 1961, when you would walk along the shore and Fair Harbor, the scallops would be dancing at your feet.
Yeah.
Dancing.
Yeah.
And you could go and get a bushel in a minute.
Yeah.
And then you, of course, it was hell cleaning them, You may have a bushel, but you got about 1.5 pounds out of all of that. But the thing is, that does not exist anymore.
Yeah, the scallops are some of the most sensitive shellfish, and so they went first, and then they were replaced by the clams, and there were a lot of clams in Great South Bay. In the 1970s, more than half of the clams eaten in the U.S. came from Great South Bay.
Really?
Yes, but there was a tremendous decline through the 70s, originally because there were so many people harvesting them. But then water quality issues became paramount. Brown tides and that fishery. I remember
brown tide. I was there.
Yeah. Well, and the unfortunate thing is the brown tide, while it's gone from the Peconic estuary, it continues on the South Shore. In fact, right now there's still brown tide going on, and that's been really inhibitory to the shellfish, scallops, and also hard clams.
Wow. Well, I have, every once in a while, the WLIW, the local Long Island will have something with a bayman. You know, there's this one show where they talk about this guy at Great South Bay. He was like the last of the guys that I used to see with those little boats with like a house on them, and they would be out there getting all of the, and there's so few of them left because that bay is practically dead.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that. I actually got into this field because of a clamor.
Really?
When I was 18 or 19, I was working for an environmental group west of here, and once a week they had a person come in to speak, and that week, one week, it was a clamor, and he came in, and essentially he just said, well, I'm a clamor, my father was a clamor, my grandfather was a clamor, bayman, and I thought my son would be as well, but there's no clams left because there was brown tide, and so it's all over. And I just stood there with my jaw agape, and it was really just, it was shocking. And then I asked him after, I said, well, you know, what's this brown tide? Well, what's causing it? And he said, we don't know. And so it was thereafter I said, well, you know, if I'm going to go to graduate school, that's something I have to study. I got to figure that out.
Find out.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, do we have hope?
Absolutely. I'm very hopeful. You know, we're in a position now that's much, much better than we were just a few years ago. In fact, you mentioned Alison Branco. You spoke to her a couple of years ago. A lot's happened in those 2 years. Suffolk County Executive Steve Bellone has declared water quality as a top issue.
That's right.
Larry Cantwell, supervisor here in East Hampton, is well aware of the issue and is championing that issue. And as I mentioned, in Suffolk County, they're making the effort now. They're going to have these new systems they can put in. Even our governor, Andrew Cuomo, knows about the issue. In fact, he's the one who started the Center for Clean Water Technology at Stony Brook. That's designed to come up with these new systems. So, you know, a few years ago, I was more pessimistic, but now I'm more optimistic.
Dr. Gobler, we could go on, but it's over, and I want to thank you so much. So much to learn.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So much to learn.
Yeah.
Really.